Thank you. Okay. Um, Bindigin, Minogi Jagat, welcome. Welcome to session D1 titled Events Revisited, Indigenous and Black Perspectives and the Importance of Memory. My name is Bimadoshka Pucan. I'm a member of Saugeen First Nation. I'm an assistant professor with the School of Community and Public Affairs at Concordia University in Montreal, Quebec. My research is focused on the sacred medicine, songs, and stories of the Anishinaabe. I use modern technology to digitize sound that had been recorded on wax cylinders over 80 years ago. I study the repatriation of intellectual cultural property to the Anishinaabe Nation. Recently, I curated an exhibit titled The Anishinaabeg of Chiefs Point at Museum London in partnership with the Saugeen First Nation. I will open this session with a presentation on the sacred medicine songs of the Anishinaabe in Ontario. Following me will be Dr. Vivian McAlister, who will present on the death of Tecumseh. Dr. McAlister is a surgeon at University Hospital, London, and a professor at Western University. He is a general surgeon with special interest in transplant and combat surgery. His research interests include fundamental, clinical, and historical knowledge of these areas. Dr. McAlister was a member of the Royal Canadian Medical Service, where he was Chief of General Surgery. He was the Angus McLaughlin Professor of Surgery at Western. He is currently Director of the Office of Military Academic Medicine at the Schulich School of Medicine and Dentistry. Dr. Kathy Slaney will talk about her great-grandfather, Dr. Anderson Abbott, and his role in the early Toronto General Hospital. Dr. Slaney is a sociologist who has written about race and equity. She was Associate Dean of Health Sciences at Sheridan College. Her book, Family Secrets, Crossing the Color Line, published by Dundurn Press, looked at the implications of racialization within her own family. Mrs. Shannon Prince will complete our panel with a presentation on the role played by graduates of the Buxton Mission School at the Freedmen's Hospital in Washington during the American Civil War. Mrs. Prince is the curator of the Buxton National Historic Site Museum. She is a descendant of the early fugitive families that came to Canada for freedom and opportunity. Shannon still actively farms in Buxton with her husband, Brian, and their 4 children. She is involved with several projects on both sides of the border regarding the Underground Railroad and Black history. Finally, we are very grateful to Dr. Alika Lafontaine for providing a commentary to our presentations. Dr. Lafontaine is the president-elect of the Canadian Medical Association. He has played an influential role in raising awareness with governments at all levels regarding Indigenous health. His use of storytelling and his descriptions of real patient encounters and his own experiences as a Cree Ojibwe Polynesian are helping change mindsets. We have no conflict of interest to report. And so with that, I'll get started. Just let me pull up my presentation. There we go. I just want to move my screen around so I can see. Sorry about that. Oh dear. And mine is not, oh, here we go. Okay. So thank you very much for having me. I'm very, very pleased to be here today to share with you my research around the medicine songs of the Anishinaabe. My name is Dr. Bimadoshka Pucan. I am an anthropologist with a background in health, quite interdisciplinary. My undergrad is in psychology and First Nation studies. My master's degree is from public health. And like I said, my PhD is in anthropology. So certainly quite interdisciplinary. And I think that's really helped me to produce this type of research, to work in this very sensitive area. And I'm very honored and actually blessed to share my work with you. So today we're going to journey back to Chiefs Point. We're going to talk about the technology, the land, the people, and we're going to finish it off by talking about cultural growth and expansion. Certainly, I relied quite heavily on the two-eyed seeing approach, but because I'm working with sound and in terms of an Indigenous, or not Indigenous, even more specific, the Anishinaabe worldview, it's sound-based. It's based on vibrations and frequencies. And so I moved from the two-eyed seeing approach into more of a two-eared hearing approach. And it's not a dichotomy. Like we heard Alicia McFadden explain yesterday in quite depth about it. It's really in how we perceive and understand what that means to be able to take a different perspective and a different worldview. So for me, my research really started when I was a little girl. I spent a lot of time with my grandmother. You see her pictured beside me. Her name was Helen Mason. Her maiden name was Helen Solomon Mandawab. She told me a lot of stories. Grateful for that, to have that time. And she actually told me lots of stories, war stories in particular. She enjoyed sharing with me. And she told me one story about two men who were fighting the Americans, the Chimokman. They were being pursued, and that these two men hid in a hole in the ground, and they could hear the soldiers walking around on top of them. And that was pretty much the end of that story. Now, fast forward, when I had attended the University of Western Ontario, I took a reading course. And here you see this book that I read. I was actually looking into the War of 1812, and I wanted to know what exactly was the Anishinaabe involvement in the War of 1812. Certainly, I grew up hearing stories about Tecumseh and that my people fought alongside him, but I wanted to know exactly who was involved in this. And so I set about on this reading course, and I was very happily introduced to this book by Dr. Edwin Seaborn called The March of Medicine in Western Ontario. It's published in 1944. And in his book, he tells the story of Indian medicine. There's a chapter on French medicine, and then the rest of the book's on British medicine. But certainly he's looking at the development of medicine in Ontario. And so within this chapter on Indian medicine is an account of from the Sable River, which is my territory. I know my land. I know where I come from. So I read about this account from the Sable River of two men fighting in the War of 1812. That these two men, had shapeshifted, changed into turtles, hid under a log, and they could hear the soldiers walking around on top of them. And it was at that moment I could hear my grandmother, word for word, as I read these lines in this story. And so that got me really excited. And so further in the story, and we're going to hear Dr. McAlister speak about this a little bit later, but within this account, Dr. Seaborn goes on to say that he made wax cylinders. He made audio recordings of medicine songs and stories with this medicine man from the Sable River. And so I set out to find out more about these recordings, and had a huge learning curve to go through. One, in that as Anishinaabe people, we don't record our sacred knowledge. And so I had a lot of questions. My family, my community had a lot of questions about, were these authentic? Were these real medicine songs? And so that took a long time for my community to work through and understand. And so we certainly had ownership problems. These things are being held in a museum. They weren't at Western at that point. They had been sent over to Museum London for storage in the vault. And so we have lots of people involved with these, people who, organizations, the museum feels they own these, yet Saugeen felt that we own the intellectual property contained on them. So this started lots of discussions within community about who we are, and what's the right thing to do. And certainly, if these are actual medicine songs, then Mishkeke, which is the Anishinaabe word for medicine, it requires a different set of ethics to work through. And we need to certainly honor those if in fact these are medicine songs. So in terms of the technology here, you see an image of the wax cylinders. We had two broken cylinders that needed to be repaired. We used the dentist, believe it or not, to repair these wax cylinders. They're little machines, they just had the perfect machinery and technology and skill to be able to repair these and realign the grooves. We sent them down to the Northeast Document Conservation Center where they were digitized. And you can see a picture of Irene at the bottom of the screen here. And I do want to point out that, it was 8 and 7, 8 wax cylinders, 7 aluminum discs. We came back with 19 audio recordings and over 4,500 digital files that we need to work through. And I want to also point out that these are actually illegal recordings. So from 1876, which was the enactment of the Indian Act, up until 1951, there's successive legislation that prevented and thwarted the development of medicine, culture, language, the development of people through this legislation. So we had certainly the residential schools. So young children taken away, and then that process of elders or medicine people sharing their knowledge to the younger generation, that stopped. So we were prevented from growing and sharing our knowledge. Not only that, but there's a language ban, there's a ceremonies ban, there's this whole culture ban. You cannot sing, you cannot dance, you cannot wear your traditional clothing. All of these had huge impacts on our culture and our ability to grow and sustain all of these areas. So what we're going to do today, and in a lot of way I thought about thinking about this, we're going to put on a stethoscope, we're going to hold it up to the wax cylinders, and we're going to try to listen to the land at Chiefs Point. And so you can see Southern Ontario here, give you a sense of where we're going. And so we're up in the point, up in the peninsula, facing Lake Huron. Gorgeous area. Please come and see it. And so we're going right now to Chiefs Point Indian Reserve, number 28. So today, the community is still, the reserve is on the north side of the Salvo River. So we're facing Lake Huron. You can see, these are the cottages. Oh, my arrow is showing. You can see the cottagers here. So this would be the surrendered side. Here's where Dr. Seaborn's cottage would have been along this line here. And they were referred to as, I believe they were called the London faction. So it's a group of folks from London, professionals, academics, who would come down here and cottaged in this line. And then over here on the right side of the Salvo River, you can see it's just labeled as Indian Reserve. So today we talk about this as our hunting ground, and only cottagers can actually live on the Indian side of the Salvo River, even though it's still an Indian Reserve today. So how is this possible that we have an Indian Reserve where Indians are not allowed to live on? And so again, these are the questions I started to ask my community. What is Chiefs Point? What's going on there? How have we been pushed off this land? And so it's again through government legislation. And in fact, Ontario surrendered all of the lakefront properties in the 1930s in order to generate income for those reserves. And it was returning soldiers actually who brought these issues forward. So once they were able to visit with each other in World War I and II, they're finding out how other people are living and their experiences. They come home and start to make differences and make changes to, or try to make the proper changes that are needed to improve our communities. So certainly all of that is in my dissertation. If you would like to read that, it can be torturous, I would think, but I love it still. So yeah, it's a unique ecosystem here in Chiefs Point, but in fact, the whole peninsula is incredibly unique. And we have areas that are, specific and special medicines grow, but we don't have access to those medicines anymore because of how we're separated from the land through legislation. So here's Robert Thompson. He is the man who's on the recordings. His Indian name was Pewaquinip. And so that means it's sort of this running around in a circle, but on purpose. So it's sort of this essence of repeating. And I think it's so appropriate that he made these recordings with Dr. Seaborn, because they go around and around and we can listen to them over and over. So he's born in 1876, the same year the Indian Act came into effect. He passed away in 1959, and he actually outlived Dr. Seaborn by 10 years. Pewaquinip was a fiddler, loved his fiddle, and he was the caller at the local barn dances. So he's also a forester. He holds records for hauling barges of with lumber down into the furniture factories in Southampton. He was also a farmer. His family sold milk to the local cottagers, but even more so, these recordings tell us that he's an orator. And we can see that from the headdress he's wearing and some other pictures we'll have a look at. So his first wife and his two children passed away. And it was during the time periods of when there was a yellow fever outbreak, and then again during the Spanish flu. And although death records are difficult to find, it's because there isn't somebody allocated to the reserve to do that. So somebody comes, every 6 months to record the deaths, and that can be very problematic for our records. And so for Robert, his ethics were that he would teach anybody who wanted to learn about the culture. And so that's important to me to honor that, and to also share his knowledge. And I'm proud to do that. So Dr. Seaborn knew Robert Thompson's father, and actually they'd been friends for a number of years. Yet Robert Thompson's father's name was John. John refused to share anything with Dr. Seaborn. And in fact, even after his death, Robert refused to share with Dr. Seaborn as well. And the response is that, it's none of your business, is what they would tell Dr. Seaborn. But eventually, Robert eventually changed his mind and yes, decided to come and make these recordings. He actually made them at Western University with Dr. Seaborn. And not only is he singing songs, but he's telling stories. And in fact, it's almost as if he's conjuring, right? That we certainly have lots of people who comment that that's what's happening. Oh, sorry about that. In the recordings, he talks about this portage route, and that Chief's Point is actually a place where families would gather to prepare to cross over. And so that can have two meanings, right? It can mean this portage route, which would then allow people to cross into Georgian Bay quite quickly. Or it means that it reflects that this is actually a very sacred site in area, and it's a burial ground. And so families would gather in order to prepare their loved ones to pass on to the spirit world. And so it's it's sort of the perfect spot geographically because the point faces west, and it's west that the Anishinaabe believe their spirit goes. And so what we're able to do with these recordings is, we can hear the death of Tecumseh, and I can compare it to the original, compare the original to the published version in Dr. Seaborn's book. And we can see if there are any types of changes that have been made along the way, and allows us to be more critical, I suppose, of published works. And that's really important for us to do as we decolonize. So making medicine at Chief's Point, when I play these recordings, everybody hears something different. And it's just because they're really rough. They're fragile, they're old, it's not the best technology in the first place to use. It takes time to develop. So everybody hears something different, but it really makes us feel much more connected to these stories. I found like community knowledge is actually undamaged. We see a picture here. This is picture was shared to me by Ken and Sue Root. And we're focusing in on Robert Thompson in his young years. And we see in the picture are other Thompson members and some people from Cape Croker. So certainly as I share these amongst the community, we're finding that, our knowledge is undamaged. It is still there. We need opportunities to share and bring that knowledge forward. But we also need to develop methodologies that operate between the silos. And so when we read, especially into Anishinaabe authors like Basil Johnson, he talks about there being many truths. And so that doesn't really work well to use statistics who's after just one truth, right? They're just incompatible and they're not appropriate together. And so we have to really think clearly about what kinds of methodologies are important and how do they reflect the worldview that we're trying to get a glimpse of. It's important to protect culture and language because that produces wellness and resilience. Clearly, Robert suffered, losing his wife and his two small children. And so what is it that kept him going and made him strong? Even as the land had been surrendered, even as he'd been pressured, under the Indian Act and still refusing and holding steadfast to his identity, his language, and his culture. That's what provides wellness and resilience in Indigenous communities. And so when we're repatriating knowledge, we have to do it in a supportive way. We can't just take this stuff and dump it on Indigenous communities because we don't have the resources. Just think about the social determinants of health and think about what our communities actually are faced with on a daily basis. So to engage and to repatriate means we have to close a lot of gaps, but we can do that. Let's have a listen. So that was Elizabeth Thompson. These are 4 new recordings I found within this big mass of digital files that came home. And actually that song is about women who fought in the Revolutionary War, who dressed as men. And so again, we think even today, right, where we're honoring this month, we're honoring two-spirited people. And we think these are new and new ways of identifying, but really they're not. We are the same people. We've always been the same people. But telling our stories really lets us become a part of, the wider web of society. And so here, when I brought the songs home, this is our young people at the bottom. They made a rap video, and they wrote the lyrics. They worked with Mijiwan Productions to make this video. That's my sister there. She's this Catholic school teacher and brings language forward in our community. So the young people, this is their response to the song, and they're singing about tying our spirits to our ancestors, but to each other and to the future. You can see an image here of the exhibit I produced along with my partner down here, Amber Lloyd Langston, fantastic lady. Here's my elder, Vern Root. This is when we're getting the award from the Lieutenant Governor for our exhibit. And so I'm grateful to Museum London because for the exhibit, I had a classroom where I invited school groups and Indigenous classrooms into the exhibit where I could teach them, you know, one-on-one, where we could be together and they could ask me questions about things that they're interested in. And so I began to question, you know, have we really changed at all? And so bringing these songs home, it's really, really inspired lots of different people and especially the youth. Here, one of the songs we brought home was the canoe song. And so what the youth did is made this birch bark canoe. And even though I live out of the community, they all have copies of the recordings. They still call me and say, hey, can you send us the canoe song? We want to bless the canoe. And so certainly I, you know, emailed the song over and even I feel like I'm a part of this huge process, even though I'm not there. And so the youth have also built a birch bark lodge where we come and play those recordings too. We share stories, songs, we eat, we gather. It's a very, very beautiful thing. So just like Robert, you know, when he's making these recordings, he was moved by sharing that knowledge, and that's ethical, demand that we Indigenous people, as Anishinaabe people, it's important that we share to the next generation that we're passing on our knowledge. So for Robert, he couldn't pass this to his children, so he made the recording so that he could get that knowledge to us today. And so I'm so happy to be able to transfer that medium so that the youth today can hear Robert's songs and stories, but that even reached back into time immemorial. So I'm grateful to have done this research, and I hope you enjoy the rest of our presentations. And we're on to Dr. McAlister. So Chimigwech and enjoy. Let me get this stop share going. All yours, Dr. McAlister. Thank you.
Thank you, Anya. Thank you, Dr. Pucan, for including me in this panel. It's been a terrific privilege and a great learning opportunity. I want to take the perspective of the non-Indigenous person dealing with this type of information and realizing how incomplete our knowledge of history is if we don't include the Indigenous or First Nations perspective. 1812 and the War of 1812, you know, was the 200-year history anniversary was not too long ago, and we spent our time trying to decide who won the war. Was it Canada or the United States? But in fact, 1812 was a world war, and extraordinary things were happening all over the world. There was fighting in Europe, fighting in the Atlantic, fighting in North and South America, and things like the Louisiana becoming the 18th state of the US occurred. The war started when the US declared war on Britain and invaded Canada. And one of the first contacts was the defeat of a US force by Tecumseh at Brownstown, just south of Detroit. One of the inciting factors in the War of 1812 was the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, arranged by Napoleon with the US. They didn't ask for the purchase of this land. They only wanted access to New Orleans, but they actually managed to purchase a swath of land as big as their current holdings to the west of the Mississippi. Now, these lands were occupied by First Nations, and the British, to some extent, considered them theirs from the defeat of France and had outlined a possible homeland for First Nations here. The war was fought viciously everywhere, and in our area. This image here depicts the invasion of Washington, D.C. by British and Canadian forces and the torching of government buildings. And the building on fire there is the Capitol. And this picture is actually in the rebuilt Capitol where the event is memorialized. By 1815, the perspectives remain the same, but things have changed slightly. Napoleon is defeated, and modern France is beginning to grow out of its history, its extraordinary history of that time. Modern Spain has its first constitution. The Latin American countries are becoming independent. And in North America, although our boundaries remained and Canada was saved from invasion, the Louisiana Purchase was confirmed with the defeat of the British in New Orleans. And the Americans rebuilt in a triumphalist fashion. This image here is of the cupola in the rebuilt Capitol, which shows the religious fervor with which nationalism engulfed the United States. The picture shows the apotheosis of George Washington. And around that cupola, friezes were painted to depict the founding events of the United States. And one of those events occurred just south or just west of London, close to Chatham at Moravian Town. In the United States, it's called the Battle of the Thames. This frieze is sometimes called the Death of Tecumseh, which is shown on the right side of the frieze, with Richard Mentor Johnson shooting Tecumseh from his horse. Interestingly, Tecumseh became a folk hero, an icon in the United States as soon as he was dead. This heroic statue was displayed underneath that frieze in the Capitol initially, before it was moved after about 30 years to the Smithsonian, where it remains today. And Tecumseh's name was used for towns in Ontario and in Michigan. And people were given his name, including Tecumseh Sherman, the general in the US Civil War. And this is Dr. Tecumseh Holmes from Chatham, Ontario, who was a surgeon and one of the founding members of faculty of the medical school at Western University. Now, the Battle of the Thames occurred at Moravian Town, where Tecumseh forced General Proctor to stand and face the Americans. The Americans were mainly a Kentucky cavalry that had come up and were defeated several times by the British and First Nations forces. But the loss of the Battle of the Lake Erie by the Royal Navy to the US, to Commodore Perry, resulted in the loss of the Great Lakes, that we no longer had control of Lake Superior, Lake Huron, and Lake Erie. And it was indefensible to stay west of Niagara. So Proctor wanted to retreat to Niagara, but Tecumseh forced him to face the Americans here at Moravian Town. It was poorly arranged, and the Americans immediately saw that the British lines were open and would be overcome with a cavalry charge. To get there, however, they would have to pass Tecumseh's forces. So they decided that mainly was a man called Richard Mentor Johnson, whom I showed you, decided that they would lead a false charge, basically a suicide charge known as the Charge of the Forlorn Hope, to draw the fire of the British, the first fire of the British, and to draw the First Nations warriors into battle. Then the main force were going to bypass them and run the British lines, which they did, and they won the day very quickly. Now, this is a Currier and Ives image. They're an American print company from the later 19th century, showing one of the events at the Battle of the Thames, and it's Richard Mentor Johnson shooting Tecumseh. And it's almost become like one of the Western movies at this stage, where Tecumseh is just another native being shot by a cowboy from his horse. However, the real story is probably something different. This is the first doctor in our story, Dr. Samuel Theobald. He is a Kentucky physician who was in the Kentucky Regiment in the US forces. And rather than act as a physician, he actually joined the charge of the Forlorn Hope. And he was the only one of the 20 who charged who was uninjured. And he was able to rescue a severely injured Richard Mentor Johnson and bring him to the back lines so that he could be looked after by the doctors and evacuated. Now, Dr. Theobald's evidence was collected by Benson Lossing in 1860. And this man is a very interesting historian. He was a journalist who became a historian and what I would call a popular historian, but he used first witness accounts as far as he could on visited sites to create his histories. And in visiting the area, he was able to get evidence regarding Tecumseh and the retreat from Windsor up to Moravian Town. And he paints an entirely different picture of Tecumseh as a noble man who commanded great respect. And in the book, he calls him General Tecumseh. And one of the interesting features was that Tecumseh was very concerned regarding the colonists who were present, as well as his own forces. And here he tells a boy that he knows his father, that is fighting with them with the Canadian side, and he advises the boy, don't let the Americans know or they'll torch your farm. Now, Dr. Pucan has described Edwin Seaborn and his role in collecting the medicine songs from Piwakana, and we're so fortunate that the two of them were able to record these songs. However, as Dr. Pucan mentioned, the song regarding the death of Tecumseh was passed down in Sauble River from family to family, and she recognized it immediately. This is the English translation that was made by Mrs. Thompson and given to Dr. Seaborn and collected and published in his book in 1944 that Dr. Pucan referred to. A man on horseback came from the Great White King to our country at the Sauble River. He had a long knife in his hand and another on his back, and he made us presents of blankets and knives and axes, and he promised us more if we would fight. So my granddaddy said to another Indian, come with me, we will fight. They were in the woods and crept by a road and saw Yankees in rows on white horses and Tecumseh on the bridge with a long knife in his hand, and he fought to his right hand and he fought to his left hand, and the long knife broke close to his hand. And he picked up the knife of another man who was dead on the bridge, and he fought to his right hand and he fought to his left hand. And a man came from behind and ran a long knife through his shoulder, and Tecumseh fell down. But Tecumseh did not die because he carried medicine, and Tecumseh is still alive somewhere, and we will see him sometime when we are hunting. And the Yankee take the body of another Indian and put it on a tree lying down and cut, hitting with a long knife. And granddaddy say, no good, why cut Indian, no good. And say to another Indian, we will go. And he turned to another, he turned other Indian and himself into small turtle, and they creep under a log. And Yankee say, where Indian? Here, where Indian? There. But he not able to find granddaddy and other Indian. And granddaddy turned other Indian and himself into a water snake, and they swim river, and they come back to the Sauble, to women and children and other Indians. So this image of the battle is entirely different. It tells you exactly what was going on there. There was a story that Tecumseh had been mutilated by the Kentuckies for war trophies. But what is described here is the mutilation of another Indian, which was as described by Benson Lossing in his book. It also shows that no quarter was given to the First Nations. If they could find any of their adversaries among the First Nations, they were going to kill them. Dr. Pucan and I have talked about a story about how the two First Nation warriors escaped. They first hid like a turtle and swam like a water snake. And Dr. Pucan said to me, no, he was a turtle and he was a water snake. So we have different perspectives on a very important part of our history that we have, although it has been published since 1944, more or less ignored it. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present this, and I look forward to the discussion afterwards. Now, next up is Dr. Kathy Slaney, who's going to talk about her great-grandfather. Kathy, you have to unmute your, there you go.
Okay, does that look right to everyone?
Looks good.
All right, I think I better put my glasses on here. Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Catherine Slaney, and today I have the honor of presenting my great-grandfather, Dr. Anderson Ruffin Abbott, and his role in the promotion of good medical practice throughout a critical period of racial and social disruption. He never faltered to speak out and up on behalf of anyone subjected to racialization and segregation. So a brief history here. During the late 19th century, German biogenesis theory became intellectually recognized and led some pioneering medical practitioners to explore transformational sanitation and sterile procedures that ultimately promoted the development of effective medical and surgical practices. Early scientists such as Robert Koch, Edward Jenner, and Louis Pasteur led the way, confirming the link between germs and disease. Once the theory was established, it became the focus of practitioners at a time when formal medical training was emerging from a state of what many considered downright quackery. Dr. Abbott was fortunate to be able to attain an exemplary classical education, initially at racially integrated private schools in Toronto, and then at the Buxton Mission School as one of 6 aspiring Black intellectuals. But in 1856, Anderson attended Oberlin College in Ohio, soaking up an appreciation of philosophy, religion, art, music, and literature, contributing to his future life role as a political and social activist, and ultimately as a scientist. Abbott then enrolled in the University of Toronto's School of Medicine, which was affiliated with the Trinity College Medical School, where his perpetual tickets for the Toronto General Hospital indicated his attendance in such courses as Materia Medica and Therapeutics, Anatomy, Obstetrics, and Diseases of Women and Children. Eager to acquire practical instruction, he took the initiative, as was typical, to pen a letter to the administration complaining that medical students were only allowed to observe during bedside rounds, and he advocated instead that attending doctors become acquainted with the different cases and give a course of lectures upon them. Dr. Abbott, along with his mentor, Dr. Augusta, regularly attended patients in the poorhouse and asylums, and probably at no charge, but the experience provided an opportunity to treat and observe at a time when it was difficult for doctors to practice on women or even cadavers for instructional purposes. At this time, Dr. Abbott developed an admiration of the flourishing accomplishments of the famous Florence Nightingale, the lady with the lamp, the British nurse and social reformer, widely considered the founder of modern nursing and foundational practices of sanitation and hospital administration. Her innovative policies of personal hygiene and disease prevention techniques revolutionized the role of hospitals during the Crimean War, when more men were dying from infection, disease, and dysentery than from their actual battle wounds. Dr. Abbott has been recognized as the first Afro-Canadian doctor, following in the footsteps of Dr. Alexander Thomas Augusta, the first Afro-American doctor, certified by the Medical Board of Upper Canada. As the first Black man to head any hospital in the US, Dr. Augusta was also the first Black man to be awarded the rank of Major of Cavalry in the US Union Army, and left as a brevet lieutenant colonel the highest rank achieved by a colored commissioned officer during the war. In tandem, this pair's early experiences provided them valuable opportunities to study the principles of disease control and hospital sanitation, which proved useful when later they served consecutively as Chief Executive Officer and Surgeon-in-Chief at the Freedmen's Hospital in Washington during the Civil War. After the war, Abbott stayed on with the Freedmen's Bureau, which had taken over the administration of 56 hospitals and staff. Dr. Abbott was one of only 8 Black doctors in the Union Army, but since he was not an American citizen, he was not eligible for an official military title and was granted the honorary rank of Captain of Cavalry to his great disappointment. Nevertheless, he recounts a glorious honor when he and Dr. Augusta made an auspicious and welcome appearance at a White House New Year's levee, dressed in full uniform, duly noted in the Washington Star the following morning. During the war, Abbott maintained a close relationship with the First Family, and upon Lincoln's assassination, Mary Todd Lincoln gifted him the houndstooth shawl the president had worn as a disguise on his journey to his inauguration. Oh, then this goes on. Abbott remained an ardent member and aide-de-camp of the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic, a fraternal organization of the Civil War veterans that undertook charitable responsibilities, providing medical services, aiding the destitute and unemployed, and providing funeral assistance. The uniqueness of its membership of 490,000 was that it could never grow or change with each passing year, while the roster gradually declined. After the Civil War, Abbott re-entered Trinity College to earn his bachelor's degree in medicine and was admitted to the College of Physicians and Surgeons and the Ontario Dominion Medical Association. By then, a variety of hospitals had already been established in Toronto, including the Toronto General Hospital. The hospital had started as a small shed in the old town and was used as a British Army military hospital during the War of 1812, becoming a permanent institution in 1829. In 1868, Dr. Abbott took over from Dr. Hampton as Surgeon-in-Chief at Toronto General. In this capacity, he would have been responsible for all patients in this integrated hospital, accessing his proficiency in business and hospital administration. Finally, he had an opportunity to establish teaching protocols of experiential learning and instruction for medical interns. In 1876, Wilson Ruffin Abbott, Dr. Abbott's father, serving as a city councillor, sold the property to the hospital for the construction of a new building. It is notable that Abbott's appointment and service at the Toronto General Hospital were not formally recognized until 2000, when his current descendants became aware of this history. It had all been news to us, and a commemorative portrait of Dr. Abbott was added to the boardroom collection of all previous surgeons in general, distinctly all white, who had served throughout the hospital's history. Medical doctors straddled a precarious occupation in terms of financial security, and most were forced to supplement their income with other professional services such as law, education, or commercial business. Dr. Augusta opened a thriving pharmacy in Toronto. Prior to the Civil War, Dr. Augusta had applied for the position of coroner in Kent County, that is Chuxton Buxton area, but his application was turned down amid strong community opposition to his race. But one day the tide would turn, and his prodigy, Dr. Abbott, would step into the position and treasure the accomplishment with great satisfaction. He moved his family to Chatham and established a thriving medical practice, while as a community leader and public school board trustee, actively promoting integrated hospitals, equal education, and social justice. During the Civil War, the practice of embalming corpses evolved, and it is highly likely that Dr. Abbott, as a proficient surgeon, would have kept himself abreast of this development. In the 1870s, the coroner's job would have demanded a high degree of investigative and analytical work. Abbott's extensive experience with Civil War deaths and a deep interest in the interpretation of the law would have made him an impressive medical examiner and chairman of the Kent County Medical Association in 1878. Sadly, although educational opportunities were available in Canada at the time, employment was not. When the family moved to Chicago, Abbott's children had more opportunity to either pursue their professional education or to acquire positions in their chosen fields. His daughter Helen graduated from the University of Toronto as a teacher and had to attain a position in St. Louis in a school actively advocating early childhood education for Black children of working mothers. His son, Wilson, a graduate of the University of Toronto and the Medical College at the University of Illinois, became clinical director of the Chicago Tuberculosis Institute until he was appointed chief of staff at the racially segregated Henrotin Hospital in Chicago and chairman of the Medical Executive Committee. As a highly qualified heart and lung specialist, he was acknowledged for his innovative treatment of tuberculosis, which involved collapsing the lung. Gordon Abbott was AR's, as we call him, youngest son, and became involved in the Toronto Power Company as a union leader dedicated to ensuring fairness and equality for safety and advancement. His advocacy was clearly a reflection of the influence of his father as an effective implementer and moderator during negotiations. In 1891, Providence Hospital in Chicago responded to the urgent medical needs of the Black community with a venue for Black doctors to practice. As the first private nonprofit integrated hospital, Providence was also the first training school for Black nurses with both Black and white medical staff. Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, a prominent African-American heart specialist performing the first open heart surgery in 1893, initially oversaw the budding new programs before moving on as surgeon-in-chief at Freedmen's Hospital. In 1894, the community urgently prevailed to Dr. Abbott to step out of retirement and assume the position of medical superintendent of the entire hospital, labs, social services, and training school. A busy facility with 85 beds, 2,000 admitted patients, and 9,000 emergency patients serviced annually. I don't know why this is this way, but throughout his career, Abbott practiced medicine while regularly inserting himself in controversial arenas, vociferously promoting racial and social justice through numerous lectures and newspaper columns. In the New York Age, a distinguished Black newspaper of opinion known as a firebrand fighter of racial injustice, and he was penning letters to all levels of administrators. He continued to pursue courses and often presented papers to the Canadian Institute on the latest scientific and philosophical concepts of the day. One such study he undertook appeared in a Toronto newspaper, soliciting information and statistics about the history of slavery, as well as recent accomplishments of African Canadians encompassing the arts, mechanical inventions, agriculture, and other workmanship. Despite the publicity surrounding his appointments at both Toronto General Hospital and Providence Hospitals, recorded history and archival recognition of Dr. Abbott's work is amazingly scant. As an ardent promoter of professional medical practice for all, equitable administration, applications, enduring community contributions, and an advocate of racial and social justice, these instances remain examples of numerous other stark omissions. If not from our historical archives, too often from the awareness of the professional medical community and general population. Based on his own papers and accomplishments, it appears that Dr. Abbott did seek to align his philosophy with that of René Descartes, to follow the science. And as you see here, the investigations of science may at times cause doubt, but that is not necessarily an evil. Doubt leads to inquiry and truth, and that word, which is truth, will emerge. Thank you. Okay. Ever onwards to Shannon.
Thanks, Kathy. Oh, sorry.
That's good. I just, let me stop sharing.
Okay. Thanks. Thank you. And thank you again for the invitation to participate in this amazing conference. I am going to stop my video only because I've been freezing several times and I noticed that and we're out in the country and anyway, that's what I'm going to do. So today I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey and another, maybe, I don't know if it's an unknown or not a very well-known part of history again, the Underground Railroad, Black history, and the settlement that I'm from, a sixth generation descendant, the Buxton National Historic Site Museum. So Buxton is certainly a very interesting place. 20 years ago, most of them were slaves who owned nothing, not even their children. Now they have their wives and their children about them. They have the great essentials for human happiness, something to love, something to do, and something to hope for. Samuel Gridley Howe, Boston, 1864. So in 1864, he was actually 1965, he was commissioned to the Freedmen's Bureau by Abraham Lincoln to travel to Canada to investigate the condition of emancipated slaves and where they had settled and how they were being established. And this is what he wrote about Buxton, you know, how very proud he was of what was happening here.
Kathy, can you share your screen?
Oh, I thought I was.
Let's try again. No worries.
Okay. What did I do? Where do I go back? Okay. Share. Oh, sorry. There. Is that it? Oh, sorry, guys.
We got it.
Okay. So yeah, there's the quote. Sorry. Oh, sorry about that. Come on. So the settlement was named to honor Lord Elgin, who at the time was the governor of Upper Canada, sorry. But it was most commonly known as Buxton in honor of Sir Thomas Fowle Buxton, who was a British abolitionist and a member of the British Parliament. And Reverend King really admired him at an early age because of his abolitionist principles. And the Elgin or Buxton settlement was founded by Reverend William King in 1849. And he was, he also had abolitionist principles, but through a variety of circumstances, he had acquired 15 slaves of his own. So he purchased and established a farm in the center of the settlement, and the barn was initially used to house the first settlers until they could build their own homes. And his home was used to hold church services and school classes until one could be built. And that is Reverend King to the left, standing in front of his house. And the other two people, I'm not sure who they were. So the land is actually 9,000 acres, 6 miles long, 3 miles wide. That was totally Black owned and operated. So when people arrived, the land was divided into 50-acre parcels of land with 10 years to pay them off and charged $2.50 an acre. So Buxton soon had a variety of industries, a mission church, several schools, saw, grist mill, potash factory, a brickyard, a post office, a blacksmith. They built a tramway to transport barrel staves and heavy lumber down to the lake for shipping. And it's interesting to note also that all the industries here, they were also Black owned and operated. And actually, Dr. Abbott's dad, Wilson Abbott, he was the owner, he was part of this organization, and he was one of the original members of the mercantile company in Buxton. And actually that was one of the first ones in Ontario. And at its peak, there were close to 2,000 Blacks that once lived here in Buxton. And this is a picture of the front of the museum. And this is the Buxton Liberty Bell. And this is a replica. The original one sits in the church in the center of the settlement. But in 1850, the people in Pittsburgh, again, heard what was happening here in the settlement. Again, very proud of how Blacks are being settled, established, and progressing. And they sent a beautiful 550-pound bronze bell from Pittsburgh to Buxton. And they inscribed it, presented to the Reverend William King, by the colored inhabitants from Pittsburgh to the academy at Raleigh, Canada West. So naturally, it summoned people to church, to school, but most importantly, it rang every time a family or a person arrived here in freedom. And so when people come to the museum, I encourage them to ring that bell. And I'll tell you, every time I hear that bell, the hairs in the back of my neck just stand up, because it's just so, to me, it's very powerful. And I've lived here all my life and I can never get enough. Reverend King and the association knew that for the settlement to be successful, they needed to be self-reliant. He needed the education, the religion, the moral and family values. But in order to achieve this, there were a lot of rules that were put in place. The land was reserved for Blacks only, purchased, not rented or sharecropped, and they had 10 years that could only be resold to Blacks. They had to clear their roads, cut ditches, and their homes had to meet minimum standards, almost like a housing development today. And this was done because there was a lot of opposition in the outlying area. Again, because Reverend King firmly believed that if Blacks are given those same opportunities as whites, they could become self-sufficient and self-sustaining. And education at Buxton was considered very paramount. Many from the northern states came to Buxton for the educational opportunities, as Kathy had alluded to earlier. And this was a classical education that included Greek, Latin, and a Christian-based education. So this was the third school that was built in the settlement, and it's still sitting beside the museum today. Built in 1861 and closed in 1968. And she also mentioned that this was an integrated school. So this photo here has 10 white children, and this is one of my favorite photos of that time period. And actually, this is a school where we all went to, my husband and I, our parents and our grandparents. So it's a wonderful piece of history that we are able to share with everyone when they come. So the first 6 graduates of the mission school went on to Knox and Trinity colleges. You have James Rapier, John Riley, Jerome Riley, Alfred Lafferty, Richard Johnson, and Dr. Anderson Abbott. So James Rapier, he was born in Alabama. He attended the Buxton Mission School in 1856, continued his education in Toronto, and then he returned back to Buxton to become the first Black teacher at this school that I just showed. Then he entered politics in 1865, giving the keynote address at the Tennessee Negro Suffrage Convention. And he received a lot of backlash from the opposition in the area, because here is this Negro colored man speaking out. But then he returned to Alabama, becoming the first committee chairman at the first Alabama Republican State Convention, and later became the first Black congressman in Alabama. And there's a beautiful portrait of him that is still in Congress. And several years ago, they were dedicating part of that building in his name, which is a wonderful tribute. Jerome Riley attended Knox College in Toronto, graduated with honors. And in 1864, his friend, Dr. Anderson Abbott, encouraged Riley to join the Union Army as a surgeon. And he remained in the United States after the Civil War, becoming one of the original founders of the Freedmen's Hospital. And John is the brother of James, but he received his education in Nashville, and he worked as a freelance journalist, contributing over 100 articles to 5 Minnesota newspapers on various issues. He was very political, very environmental. And then in 1862, he enrolled in the Department of Medicine and Surgery at the University of Michigan, but didn't receive a Doctor of Medicine until 1863 from the University of Iowa. And he had to leave Michigan due to the racism that he encountered in Michigan, and he really wanted to stay there because that was his first choice. And then he sought and obtained a commission as an assistant surgeon in the Union Army, and he spent the remainder of his life on the staff of the Freedmen's Contraband Hospital. And here is Anderson Abbott, that we've heard some wonderful stories about from Kathy, gained his medical experience under Alexander Augusta, becoming one of the 8 Black surgeons to serve in the Union Army during the Civil War, and one of the founders of the Freedmen's Hospital in Washington, D.C. And Dr. Alexander Augusta graduated from Medical College in Toronto. In 1863, he wrote a letter to President Lincoln to request he work as a doctor to the colored regiments that were being formed during the Civil War. And he became the first African-American doctor to be commissioned as a medical officer in the Union Army. Uh-oh, sorry. Freedmen's Hospital was founded in 1862 in Washington, D.C., originally known as the Contraband Hospital. This was a facility that cared for emancipated slaves that were also known as contrabands. And this was the first hospital for former slaves, and it later became the major hospital for African Americans. And in 1894, it transitioned to Freedmen's Hospital School of Nursing. William Powell was born free, but he was one of 13 Black surgeons during the Civil War, and he worked as a contract assistant surgeon with the Union Army. And in 1863, he was later hired as an assistant surgeon at the Contraband Hospital. And this is Elizabeth Keckley, who was born into slavery, and she met Mary Todd Lincoln in 1861 and became her seamstress. And she founded the Contraband Relief Association in 1862, receiving donations from many white patrons, along with the Lincolns and well-to-do free Blacks. And this is a picture of the Freedmen's Hospital 1904-ish. And this is an article, and it talks about regarding Dr. Augusta being a colored man wearing gold leaf epaulets and it was a demonstration that was led by Mrs. Keckley, the Ladies Contraband Relief Association founder. So today we have honored traditions, the stories, the memories and legacies our cultures have inherited from generation to generation, and how education has transformed former slaves into first-class citizens and successful pillars of the community. So thank you very much. Okay, so how do I go back? Stop share. Okay, there. Am I back? Okay. I have to see where I'm at here.
That was excellent, Shannon. Thank you so very, very much. Dr. Lafontaine, would you like to offer any words?
Yeah, I'll truncate my my words just because I want to give a lot of time for people to interact with the panelists for questions. I just want to say thank you. You know, when I saw this session titled Events Revisited, Indigenous and Black Perspectives and the Importance of Memory, it really made me think about something that my grandfather taught me growing up. And that's what we remember shapes what we become. Yeah. And I think as I've experienced this session, I more deeply appreciate how much of our memories, especially our collective memories in medicine, are only partial parts of the truth of our history. And, you know, I look at, you know, Dr. Pucan and the history that you shared about the sacred songs that were recorded, and, you know, especially that history of the legislation that was in place. Like, this was very high risk for people to actually record these songs. So it was not just amazing that these songs survived, but also that they were recorded in the first place. And how much richer are we that you took time to digitize these recordings and partner with elders from Chiefs Point so we could all be enriched by that history. You know, I've known Dr. McAlister for years. We served together on the Council of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada. Him taking time to talk about the translation in English of that Saugeen medicine song with Tecumseh as the subject. I mean, that really brought attention to this song and how the history that we remember about the Battle of the Thames is incomplete when we look at the full story. Dr. Kathy Slaney talking about your great grandfather, Dr. Anderson Abbott, and his history at the Toronto General Hospital and his contributions to the military and his medical career, and his role as a physician, administrator, educator. It just really deepens the rich history of Medicine Canada. I personally just bought Dr. Slaney's book, Family Secrets Crossing the Color Line, and I'm looking forward to learning more about the role of Black physicians and my own history as a person who lives in Canada. And then Ms. Shannon Prince, and talking about how your ancestors fled in order to escape discrimination and slavery. And, my own shared experience of knowing that when people are given the opportunity to be respected, be treated as equal, and really have the freedom to explore ways for them to improve their own lives and the lives of people around, they excel. I'm really struck that the Buxton Mission School had such high standards that, families of all classes and ethnic backgrounds, not just those from a Black ancestry, wanted to attend these schools. And the history of Black physicians serving in the Civil War that graduated Buxton School it's amazing, but shouldn't be surprising to any of us. Understanding our history, the role of physicians in impacting world affairs, really creating space for these stories to be honored, gives us all the opportunity to better understand the world we live in and ourselves. And I think it also shows that as physicians, we have a much more broad impact than just direct patient care. When we listen, when we advocate, and when we lead, we really can change the world. And I think each of these stories, to some degree, has shown how that's possible. As has been said many times in the presentation, although we may not be personally aware of these stories, it doesn't mean that these stories are forgotten. We just haven't made space for these stories to be remembered by us. And I remembered all through the presentations a line from Dr. Pucan's presentation that community knowledge isn't damage. And I hope that's one of the many learnings that each of us walks away from this experience remembering. I think many of these stories change us personally. I know that I've been changed personally as I've listened to the stories that you've helped uncover and your own histories. And I think a lot of these stories can change Canada if we amplify them and share them with our colleagues. So thank you to each of the presenters for revisiting our shared history and honoring these stories. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks so much for that. Those are excellent words. And I'm so grateful that you were able to take some time away from your busy schedule to join us. Dr. McAlister, if I may bother you next, we have a question from Shelley McKellar in the chat box. And so she's certainly asking me and you, but I think you're probably much better at speaking to Dr. Seaborn's work within the hospital, if and how that affected his work in terms of his interactions with Robert Thompson, or with Indigenous knowledge and medicines, if that changed or affected how he performed in the hospital. Would you like to comment, sir?
Well, I think the question is totally appropriate, and it applies to me as much as to Dr. Seaborn. But I do agree with Dr. Lafontaine that this is a shared history, and we all have to contribute. But with respect to Seaborn himself, I think he was an extraordinary man, an absolutely extraordinary man. His interests were very widespread. He was not just interested in medicine. He was not just interested in his own background. He searched far and wide, so that he was interested in natural history. He was interested in equine medicine. One of his papers is on the estrus cycle of the horse, I don't think there'd be any doctors writing about that today. And I think it all goes back to his experience in summer when he was growing up. So every summer he spent up at the Saugeen, and he grew up there wild, running around the neighborhood. He did not know any borders there. So Peter Thompson was actually his boyhood friend, and they both grew up together in the river, in the reeds, looking at animals. And that changed him and gave him that perspective that I think overcame some of the prejudices of the period. So I don't know if you agree with me, Shelley. Do you want to comment?
No, I was just interested because you've done more research than I have in terms of what was the nature of, was there an interchange actually happening?
Oh, yes, very much so. Yeah, he remained a friend. And I think Dr. Pucan described how he had to cajole the Thompsons over an entire lifetime to actually share. He knew the stories because he was present when they were told, but he could not share them. And he asked and asked and asked. And there is an interesting thing about medicine songs, and I think Dr. Pucan could comment on this, and that is that some are sacred, some are not, but they all belong to a family. And it's that family's privilege to pass them on and tell them. So you can imagine, it's a bit like, I think, among our friends where you have a joke and you tell somebody else's joke, you've kind of stolen their thunder. And I'm not sure if it's probably much more serious than that. But Dr. Pucan, you could describe how the ownership of these songs is important.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for that, Dr. McAlister. I agree. I think Seaborn certainly was affected in terms of how he practiced it. He had to have been. His relationship with the Thompsons was, I find it in any of the documents that I can find and look at, it was very, very respectful. I do want to comment about the sacred. I teach a course at Concordia in First People Studies called Sacred Stories. And we spend the first several classes talking about that maybe sacred isn't the appropriate word or concept. Sacred is it's a very colonized word. And when we think about sacred, we automatically think hands off, that's for somebody special. I was a Catholic. So when I think about certain parts of Catholicism, that's only for the priest, right? The priest is the one who speaks to God. I talk to the priest. He's the sort of the vector, right? So I think we kind of get into this idea that sacred means we're not allowed to have a part of it, right? That's somebody else's knowledge. And so we talk a lot in my course about decolonizing the sacred, that maybe we should be talking about Indigenous knowledge in terms of what is private and what is public. And that's, again, bringing back to what Dr. McAlister said about there are some songs that are sacred and some are not. So more or less, I think it's better to say that some are private and some are public. And I did share the ones that my community felt could be shared publicly. One of them was sitting sort of a little bit, put people a little bit on edge. And that was the one we shared about the song about making love medicine. And so even how the songs are labeled on the surface is concerning for, my community, but it's concerning for lots of people, just how they're labeled. And so we think a lot more, spend time to think about how those labels are colonized and how they may not be appropriate. However, the fact that they had sacred on them, that meant the museum saved them. Somebody didn't throw those away. So I'm glad, right? Like it's sort of this catch-22. It's shitty, but it's good too. And so we sort of try to maneuver through this really difficult sort of position. So that's one thing that we do talk about is this, maybe the sacred isn't important. And I do give an example. I tell my students a story about being at the powwow when we're dancing. We'll be dancing to a song that's considered social. Anybody can dance to it. We call it an intertribal. So all the tribes, doesn't matter what parts of the land you come from, everybody can dance to this song. However, if the song strikes somebody who carries an eagle whistle, if that song strikes something in that person's spirit, they have the authority to come over and to whistle up the song. That automatically, as soon as that whistle is blown, it moves that song and that dance from social and sort of public, and it moves it into the private. Whereas all of a sudden we are not recording, we are not taking pictures. certain ceremonial actions are happening, within this wider dance. And so it's very much a moving target. And so trying to put things into a category, into these silos, it just doesn't work for Indigenous knowledge. So much of it exists in between, the silos that we have created, especially in the academy. And it makes it really difficult to move our knowledge forward. And so that's one place I think our allies can help is, reach out to Indigenous communities, talk to us, tell us about the things that are in the archives, things that are, kept within the medical schools, part of medical knowledge. Let's try to work together to really improve healthcare access, and even the right for people to choose the types of care they want, right? We can do all of those things, but it means taking a more holistic approach. And we talk about that all the time, right? That's mental, spiritual, physical, emotional, all of those things matter. And when one of those areas is out of balance, it puts the other areas out of balance as well. It makes it difficult to try to diagnose and treat disease and illness. And so again, I just find this is so appropriate that these songs are coming out at this time, and in a way that we can all take part and listen, learn, and try to really put ourselves in that different sort of mind frame. And it really, I think for me, begs us to recognize that medicine is an art. It is a cultural artifact. Every culture's got their own way of practicing medicine, and it reflects their environment, their activities, their occupations, the things that hurt them, the things they get sick from. That's very much a part of the way people live. And it cannot be a one size fits all for the world. And again, I could go on and on forever about why it's important, but I'm just grateful that you're all here, that you're trying to learn, listen, and embrace another way of thinking. And I also, did I answer your question? Shelley, I could talk forever, sorry. We got lots of action in the chat. So we do have a question for Dr. Slaney. Jamal 1 would like to ask you about how and what do we define as Blackness? And so Jamal is telling us about William Wright, who graduated as an MD in 1848, taught at McGill for 30 years, served as a chair. We can see a description of this gentleman's career there. Dr. Slaney, would you like to comment on defining Blackness? Wait, we got you on mute. Thank you.
Well, yes, that was a very complicated word to define. Even when I was writing, black or white, capitalized or non-capital. And then, of course, when I'm writing historically, maybe using the actual terminology they used then as Negro and all kinds of other words we don't like to use today. So, and myself, as having grown up as white and identifying as white, I really wasn't part of that culture. It was very difficult to even insert myself enough to find out a little more about it, because I wasn't basically one of them. So for me, Blackness is just me beginning to absorb a part of that identity. And for my children, and I have children, I have grandchildren of mixed heritage now. And so we are quite a combination. My American cousins, who are more, obviously, much more connected to the Black community, still embrace everybody all the same when we get together. There really is no color difference, but I am aware and sensitive to the terminology, and kind of wish there wasn't a difference to have to become one or the other. So I guess it just depends how you feel about yourself, and then where you insert yourself into this diaspora. Sorry, I really don't have an answer. It's a tricky one.
That was awesome. That was great. No, that was perfect. We have a question from Magdalena for Shannon Prince. She'd like to know if you could talk about the standards for the Buxton community. If you could talk about where they came from, what those standards were. And then they go on to ask about the homes that were built by the members. Were they distinct from their neighbors? Could you physically, I guess the question is, can you physically see the difference between the Buxton settlement and surrounding white community?
Well, as I spoke to earlier, because there was a lot of opposition in the outlying area, and Reverend King wanted to demonstrate that Blacks could be successful. So some of the rules that he put in place, and actually he traveled to various communities, like he was down in Windsor area, he was out in Dresden, we went up to the Talbot settlement as well. So he was traveling to various settlements to see how they were being established. So basically he, extracted some from various ones. And so these are the ones he compiled for here. So basically your homes had to be 18 by 12 by 24. You had to have at least 4 rooms. You had to have a flower garden, vegetable garden, a picket fence, a porch, and 33 feet back from the road. Now, what's interesting is the fact that you had 10 years to pay that off. So, if Dr. McAlister, paid off his, farm, within the first 6 years, but he got lazy and he didn't want to put up a fence. He wouldn't get the deed to that property until all those rules are met. So, and it didn't matter how you designed it, at least you had to have at least 4 rooms. So we have the oldest home that was built in the settlement beside the museum. And it's wonderful because you can touch that 1850 black ash. And people lived in there from 1850 until 1988. So it's amazing. And they, and you had to dig ditches in front that I mentioned earlier. But again, it was that sense of community. Everybody helped everybody. When you arrived, they would come and help you build your home, clear your ditch in front of your home, that sort of thing. So it was that sort of sense of community. And the difference between, and I guess because they didn't really have any plans per se to go by, because when they were enslaved, they didn't know how to read and write. They gained that capability because they were the blacksmiths, they were the farmers, they were the carpenters. So they were very talented and skilled people. So they brought all of those memories and that skill set with them when they arrived here. So you had different styles. So people right here in Buxton, even though you had to have those restrictions to your home, you could have them 2 stories, you could have them 1, that sort of thing. And the home that my great grandfather built, it was a shotgun house. And basically you could stand at the front door and look through all the rooms, from room to room, and shoot a gun right through it from one end of the house to the other. And I was probably maybe 10, and they built onto the back of that house. And we just tore that house down probably 15 years ago. A lot of great memories in that house for me. But yeah, does that answer your question?
Okay, you know what? We have talked a minute too long.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. So interesting. Thank everybody for coming. Thank you, Dr. Lafontaine, for making time to join us today. We're so grateful, and we're grateful for your comments and commentary. Thank you, Dr. Slaney, Dr. McAlister. Thank you, Mrs. Prince. It's going to be great. So we're going to all get kicked off now because they've got to go and open up the next talk. So thank you very much, and we'll see you at the next presentation. Bye-bye, everybody. Miigwech. Guabmin.